Have you ever wondered what really happens behind prison walls? The stories hidden from the public are darker than you can imagine. Today, we uncover the secrets of public prison executions and their shocking legacy. Stay with us and hit subscribe so you don't miss a single story. The trapdoor fell in silence. No shouting crowd, no cheering, no angry mob pressing forward to see a man die. Only a small group of officials stood inside a prison yard, their boots scraping against cold stone. A hood was pulled low over the prisoner's face. A rope hung above him, swaying slightly in the morning air. When the signal was given, the lever dropped and the body vanished below the platform. Outside the prison walls, the town went on with its day. No one screamed. No one fainted. No one threw stones or prayed out loud. This was not how executions used to happen in America. And that silence was the most frightening part. Because in the 1870s, death did not disappear. It was simply hidden. But what happened behind those walls would change the justice system forever, and not everyone agreed it was justice at all. And as one execution ended in secret, another was already being planned, with consequences no one could yet see. Stay with me. Years earlier, executions were public events. When someone was sentenced to die, the town knew. Flyers were posted, bells rang, people traveled miles to watch. Vendors sold food, parents brought children. Death became a spectacle. In the early 1800s, public hangings were common across the United States. Town squares, fields, and courthouse lawns turned into execution grounds. Officials believed public death would scare people into obeying the law. But instead, the opposite often happened. Crowds laughed, some drank, others fought. Pickpockets worked the edges of the crowd while a man prepared to die. In some towns, executions felt more like fairs than warnings. Ministers complained that the crowds mocked death instead of respecting it. Newspapers wrote that public hangings hardened people instead of teaching them right from wrong. By the time the 1870s arrived, America was changing fast. Cities were growing, prisons were expanding, the government wanted more control, and public executions were becoming a problem the state could no longer ignore. Officials began to argue that death should be serious, quiet, and controlled. They said executions should not be entertainment. They claimed fewer crowds meant less cruelty. They said silence brought respect. But critics asked a terrifying question. If no one sees what the state does, how can anyone be sure it is done right? Inside prisons, executions were far from peaceful. Prison records from the 1870s described condemned men breaking down in their cells. Some begged guards for news from the outside. Others refused food. A few tried to harm themselves before the execution date. Guards were ordered to remain calm and professional, but many struggled. Some drank before executions. Others asked to be reassigned. A few quit their jobs entirely. Prison walls did not erase fear. They trapped it. Executions inside prisons also raised legal concerns. When death happened publicly, mistakes were seen. If a rope failed or a sentence was wrong, people knew. Now, errors could be hidden, and sometimes they were. One real case from the 1870s shook public trust. A man convicted of murder was executed inside a state prison after a rushed trial. Witnesses later admitted they were pressured. Evidence was weak. Once the execution was done, it was too late to fix anything. No crowd had seen it. No protest had stopped it. No public record told the full story. The prison reported the execution as orderly and successful, but rumors spread outside the walls. People began to ask whether silence protected justice or protected the state from criticism. Newspapers struggled with this new system. Some editors supported private executions, saying public hangings were barbaric. Others warned that secrecy allowed abuse. Editorials asked hard questions. Who decides who dies? Who checks the state's power? What happens when prisons become execution chambers without witnesses? Families of the condemned suffered the most. Some were not allowed to say goodbye. Others were told only after the execution had already taken place. Grief arrived without warning, and anger followed. At the same time, prisons themselves were changing. The 1870s saw the rise of stricter discipline, silence rules, and isolation. Executions became part of that system. Death was no longer a public lesson, it was a private punishment. Prison officials believed this made inmates more obedient. Knowing someone could be taken quietly and never return created fear. Not loud fear, but deep fear. A fear that lived in the walls. But fear has consequences. By the late 1870s, some states debated taking executions even further from public view. New methods were discussed. New laws were written. The state wanted total control over death, and once that control was established, it would never fully give it back. But the question remained: did moving executions into prisons make America safer, or did it simply hide violence behind locked doors? That question would soon face its greatest test, because one execution, planned in silence, carried out behind stone walls, was about to go terribly wrong. And when the truth leaked out, the nation would be forced to look directly at what it had allowed to happen in secret. The execution was supposed to be quiet. No crowd, no noise, no mistakes. That was the promise of prison executions. But on this morning in the late 1870s, inside a state prison in the United States, something went terribly wrong. The prisoner was let out just before sunrise. His hands were tied. His face was pale, not just from fear alone, but from weeks of waiting in a narrow stone cell where light barely entered. He had heard the trap door being tested the night before. The sound echoed through the prison like a warning. This was how death worked now. Not sudden, not public, slow and silent. Only a small group of officials were allowed inside. The warden, a doctor, a sheriff, a minister, all men chosen by the state, all sworn to follow procedure.
The rope was placed, the hood was lowered, the signal was given, and when the trap door fell, the rope did not break the man's neck. He did not die quickly. Seconds passed, then more. The body twisted, the rope stretched, the witnesses shifted uncomfortably. This was not supposed to happen. No crowd was there to shout or gasp, but the silence made it worse. The doctor waited. The man was still alive. Minutes passed before death finally came. Later, the prison reported the execution as successful, but someone inside talked. And when word reached the outside world, people began to realize something terrifying. If executions were hidden, who would stop this from happening again? In the days after, rumors spread faster than facts. Newspapers hinted at problems without details. Editors had not been allowed inside. They relied on whispers from guards, prison workers, and relatives. Some said the man suffered for nearly 15 minutes. Others said the rope was too long. Some claimed the warden rushed the process. No one could prove anything. That was the danger of secrecy. In earlier years, public executions forced officials to be careful. Hundreds of eyes watched every movement. Now, only a handful of witnesses stood between life and death, and those witnesses worked for the state. Across the country, similar executions were happening behind prison walls. In Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and parts of the South, states quietly shifted death sentences indoors. Some prisons built special gallows in courtyards or enclosed rooms. Others reused storage areas, turning ordinary spaces into places of execution. The condemned were often moved days before their death into isolation cells. Guards were ordered to limit contact. Prisoners spoke to ministers, but rarely to family. For many inmates, the worst part was not the execution, it was the waiting. Some counted footsteps in the hallway, others listened for keys turning. When guards passed their cell, prisoners froze, unsure if this was the moment. Silence became a weapon. Prison staff were affected too. Wardens wrote private letters describing sleepless nights. Doctors argued with officials about when death had truly occurred. Some guards refused to attend executions after their first time, but refusal came at a cost. Jobs were scarce, prisons were powerful. Saying no could mean losing everything. So most stayed quiet, just like the executions. As secrecy grew, so did public suspicion. Religious leaders questioned whether hidden executions removed moral responsibility from society. If the public did not see death, did it still learn anything? Legal experts raised another concern. When executions were public, governors sometimes granted last-minute pardons after public pressure. Crowds could demand mercy. Now, executions happened before anyone could react. Justice moved faster, and sometimes too fast. One real case haunted reformers. A young man, barely in his 20s, was executed inside a prison after being convicted on weak evidence. Years later, another man confessed to the crime on his deathbed. Nothing could be undone. The prison record showed only one sentence: execution carried out according to law. That line appeared again and again in prison logs across the 1870s. Clean words, messy deaths. The state defended itself. Officials claimed private executions reduced cruelty. They said crowds encouraged violence. They argued silence restored seriousness to punishment. And for some citizens, that argument worked. They did not want their children watching hangings. They did not want towns turning death into entertainment. But others saw something darker. They believed secrecy protected the state, not the people. By the late 1870s, debates grew louder. Should journalists be allowed inside prisons? Should executions be delayed for review? Should the public know exactly how death was carried out? Prison officials resisted all of it. Control was the goal, and control was slipping, because stories were leaking. Former inmates began to talk after release. Guards drank too much and shared details. Ministers spoke in sermons about what they had seen. Slow deaths, botched hangings, prisoners crying out behind walls no one could hear. The image of calm, humane prison executions began to crack, and with it, trust in the system. Inside prisons, inmates noticed the change too. Executions were no longer distant events. They happened nearby. Prisoners heard the gallows being built. They heard prayers being spoken. They heard nothing afterward. No cheers, no bells, just absence. Cells emptied and stayed empty. This created fear that spread through the prison population. Some inmates became obedient, others grew desperate. Suicide attempts increased. Violence rose in some facilities. The state wanted quiet. Instead, it created pressure. As the decade neared the end, lawmakers faced a choice: either open the process again or push executions even deeper into secrecy. And that choice would lead to a decision that changed American executions forever. A new method was coming, a new promise of humanity, a new kind of silence, and it would be tested first on a man already condemned. His execution would not only end a life, it would mark the beginning of a new era of hidden death. And when the switch was thrown, the country would realize that moving executions into prisons had only been the first step. What came next would be even harder to see. The switch was ready. Inside the prison, officials stood still,
watching the machine like it might breathe on its own. Wires ran along the wall. A wooden chair waited in the center of the room. The condemned man was brought in quietly, his footsteps soft on the floor. No crowd stood outside. No bell rang in town. This was the future of execution. Silent, hidden, controlled. They said it would be painless. They said it would be quick. They said this new method would end the shame of botched hangings. But when the switch was thrown, something went wrong again. And once more, it happened where almost no one could see. By the late 1870s, many Americans had lost faith in hanging. Stories of slow deaths and broken ropes had spread. Prison executions were supposed to fix the problem, but secrecy only made people more uneasy. So officials searched for a better way. They wanted an execution that looked modern, something clean, something that felt scientific. Electricity was new and powerful. It lit streets, it ran machines. Some believed it could end a life instantly. Prison reformers supported the idea. Politicians liked it. Newspapers called it progress. And once again, the prison was chosen as the place where this experiment would happen. Behind walls, behind doors, behind silence. The condemned man that day had spent weeks alone. He heard rumors from guards. He knew something different was coming. No rope, no gallows, just a chair and wires. In his final hours, he asked questions no one answered.
How long would it take? Would it hurt? Would anyone hear him? The guards avoided his eyes. When he was brought into the execution room, witnesses took their places. A doctor, a warden, a few officials. No reporters, no public. The door was closed. The switch was thrown. The man's body stiffened. The smell of burning filled the air. The doctor stepped forward, unsure. The switch was pulled again and again. What was meant to be instant became prolonged. Afterward, officials claimed the execution was humane, but those inside the room never forgot what they saw. News leaked slowly. Whispers turned into headlines. The public learned that the new method was not perfect, that science did not erase suffering, that secrecy did not guarantee mercy. People asked the same questions they had asked before. If this happens inside prisons, what else happens there? If no one watches, who is accountable? If the state controls death, who controls the state? These questions did not fade. They grew louder. Prisons in the late 1870s had become places of total power. They controlled movement, silence, work, punishment, and now death itself. Executions were no longer moments shared by society. They were procedures. Forms were signed, times were logged, bodies were removed, and life continued. This distance made executions easier to perform, but harder to understand. Many citizens stopped thinking about them at all. Death sentences disappeared into stone buildings, out of sight, out of mind. For inmates, the impact was heavy. They knew death could come quietly, no warning, no crowd to plead to, no chance for mercy from the public. Some prayed, some lost hope, others hardened. The prison became a place where the state decided not just how people lived, but how they died. This power changed the meaning of justice. By the end of the decade, the shift was complete. Public executions were nearly gone. Prison executions were the norm, and new methods promised even more distance between the public and death. What started as an effort to remove spectacle had created something else entirely. A system where death was managed, hidden, and normalized. Today, when people argue about executions, few remember this turning point. Few remember when death moved behind walls and stayed there. But the consequences remain. Because once society stopped watching, the state learned it could act alone. And once death became quiet, it became easier to repeat. If you want to understand how this silence shaped modern justice and what it still hides today,
Stay with me. The story does not end here. The prison door closed with a heavy sound. Once it shut, nothing from the outside world could get in. No voices, no protests, no last-minute mercy. Inside those walls, the state had full control. This was the final result of the change that began in the 1870s. Executions were no longer public warnings, they were private decisions, and that power was about to be used more often than ever. By the end of the 1870s, most Americans no longer saw executions with their own eyes. They read about them days later, sometimes weeks later. Short notices appeared in newspapers. A few lines, no details. Executed at the state prison this morning. Sentence carried out according to law. That was all. No mention of fear, no mention of pain, no mention of mistakes. Death became paperwork. For lawmakers, this was success. The public was calmer, towns were quieter, no crowds gathered after executions anymore. But something important was lost: responsibility. Before, when executions were public, the whole town shared the moment. If something went wrong, everyone saw it. If a sentence felt unfair, people could react. Now, the state acted alone. Governors approved death warrants without pressure. Wardens followed orders. Doctors signed papers. Each person did only one small part. No one felt fully responsible. That made executions easier. Inside prisons, the routine became cold and familiar. An inmate would be removed from general population weeks before execution, placed in isolation. Guards spoke less. Food portions changed. A chaplain visited regularly. Other inmates knew what it meant. Someone was about to disappear. On execution day, work schedules continued. Meals were served. The prison ran as normal. Only a small section was closed off. Life and death happened at the same time. This contrast haunted many who lived behind those walls. Some prison officials began to worry, not about the prisoners, about themselves. Wardens wrote in private journals about guilt. Doctors questioned their role. Ministers struggled with faith. They believed punishment was necessary, but they also saw suffering up close. One chaplain later said the silence was worse than screams. At least screams reminded people that someone was dying. Silence made it feel unreal. As the 19th century moved forward, the system created in the 1870s stayed in place. Executions remained hidden. New methods replaced old ones, but the core idea stayed the same: keep death out of sight. This shaped modern prisons in ways few people notice. Prisons became places not just of punishment, but of final decisions. Once inside, a person could be erased quietly. No crowd to object, no witness to question, no memory left behind. Critics warned of a dangerous future. If the public no longer sees executions, it may stop thinking about them. If people stop thinking about death sentences, they stop asking hard questions. Who deserves to die? Who decides? Who might be innocent? Those questions require attention. Silence removes attention. By the early 1880s, the groundwork was set. The state had learned to manage death without noise. That lesson would be used again and again in the years to come. Executions increased in efficiency. Records became cleaner. Public debate faded. And once death became routine, it became easier to expand. This is the legacy of public prison executions.
Not just where death happened, but how it was hidden, and how hiding it changed everything. The shift that began in the 1870s still affects the justice system today. When executions happen now, they follow the same path: behind walls, away from crowds, under strict control. Most people never see them. Most people never think about them. And that may be the most powerful outcome of all. Because when society stops watching,
power grows unchecked. And when death becomes silent, it becomes easier to accept. This story does not end here, because the system built in the 1870s still stands, and the question remains: should justice ever happen where no one can see it? Stay with me. Years passed, but the silence stayed. Prisons across the United States had learned something powerful in the 1870s. If executions happened quietly, people would slowly stop paying attention. Death could become part of the system, not a moment of shock. And that is exactly what happened. By the time the next generation grew up, many Americans had never seen an execution and never expected to. For them, death sentences were words on paper, not events. A name in a newspaper, a short notice at the bottom of a page. Executed at dawn, sentence fulfilled. Nothing more. Inside prisons, executions became routine. Not normal, not easy, but routine. Wardens kept checklists, guards rehearsed movements, doctors prepared statements before the execution even began. Everything was planned to avoid mistakes, delays, or noise. Yet fear never disappeared. Prisoners felt it in the walls. They felt it in the way guards avoided certain cell blocks. They felt it when someone was moved and never returned. Death had become invisible, but it was always close. For prisoners sentenced to die, the silence was crushing. They no longer heard crowds outside, no chanting, no prayers from strangers, no sign that anyone beyond the prison cared. Some wrote letters that were never answered. Others spoke to chaplains, asking the same question again and again. Will anyone remember me? Often the answer was no. Their deaths would be recorded, their bodies buried, their stories forgotten. This was the true cost of hidden executions. Outside the prisons, the public grew distant. People trusted that the state knew what it was doing. If executions were hidden, many assumed they must be handled properly. Few asked questions. Fewer demanded change. This distance made it easier for lawmakers to expand the system. More crimes became punishable by death. Appeals became shorter. Executions became faster. Not louder, just quicker. But silence does not erase doubt. Every so often, a story broke through. A wrong conviction discovered too late. A botched execution leaked to the press. A confession that came after death. Each story caused brief outrage. Then silence returned. Because without witnesses, outrage had nowhere to stand. Former prisoners who survived death row spoke of the fear that never left them. They described hearing keys at night, wondering if this was the moment. They described watching guards avoid eye contact in the days before an execution. They described the quiet after, a quiet that felt heavier than noise. By hiding executions, the state removed society from the act of killing. Responsibility was divided so thin that no one person carried it fully. The judge passed the sentence, the governor approved it, the warden carried it out, the doctor confirmed death. Everyone played a role, no one owned the act. This system began in the 1870s, and it never truly ended. Today, executions still happen the same way. Behind walls, away from crowds, under strict control. Most people never see them. Most people never think about them. And because of that, the system remains powerful. This is not just history, it is a warning. Public executions were cruel. They turned death into spectacle. But when executions moved into prisons, something else happened.
death became easier to ignore. And when society ignores death, it stops asking whether it is justified. This is the story of public prison executions. Not just the moment of death, but the moment when the public turned away, when silence replaced witnessing, when control replaced accountability, and when justice began to happen where no one could see it. If this story made you think, stay with the channel. More real stories are coming, stories hidden in history, stories buried behind walls, stories that still shape the world we live in today. Don't look away. The room was empty again. The chair had been wiped clean, the floor scrubbed, the door locked. By morning, nothing showed that a man had died there. This was the final stage of what began in the 1870s. Executions were no longer moments the nation faced together. They were events erased almost as soon as they happened. And that erasing became the system's greatest strength. As the years moved on, the lessons learned in the 1870s were copied everywhere. New prisons were designed with execution rooms built in. Witness lists stayed short, records stayed simple, the public stayed outside. What started as a promise to reduce cruelty became a way to reduce attention. Executions did not stop arguments, they stopped conversations. Lawmakers noticed something important. When the public could not see executions, protests were smaller, debates were quieter, laws passed faster, death sentences faced less resistance. Silence made power smooth. So the state kept choosing silence. Inside prisons, staff followed routines shaped decades earlier. Guards learned not to talk, doctors learned not to describe, wardens learned to say as little as possible. Everyone learned the same rule: do your job, go home, say nothing. This rule protected careers. It also protected the system. For prisoners, the fear never changed. Those on death row lived with the same question every night: will tomorrow be the day? Without crowds or public noise, time felt endless. Days stretched, nights grew longer. Some prisoners lost track of weeks, others counted cracks in the wall to stay sane. The silence did not calm them, it crushed them. Families suffered in a different way. They often received short notices after the fact, no warning, no chance to speak, no final goodbye. Grief arrived suddenly and without closure. For many families, the pain lasted longer because the death felt unreal. No moment to mark it, no public memory, just absence. The public, meanwhile, grew used to not knowing. Executions became statistics, numbers in reports, mentions in history books. The emotional weight faded, and with it faded the sense that these deaths belonged to everyone. This is the lasting legacy of public prison executions. Not the rope, not the chair, not the method. The legacy is distance. Distance between the public and the punishment. Distance between the state and...
Not just where death happened, but how it was hidden, and how hiding it changed everything. The shift that began in the 1870s still affects the justice system today. When executions happen now, they follow the same path: behind walls, away from crowds, under strict control. Most people never see them. Most people never think about them. And that may be the most powerful outcome of all. Because when society stops watching, power grows unchecked. And when death becomes silent, it becomes easier to accept. This story does not end here, because the system built in the 1870s still stands, and the question remains:
Should justice ever happen where no one can see it? Stay with me. Years passed, but the silence stayed. Prisons across the United States had learned something powerful in the 1870s. If executions happened quietly, people would slowly stop paying attention. Death could become part of the system, not a moment of shock.
Don't look away. The room was empty again. The chair had been wiped clean, the floor scrubbed, the door locked. By morning, nothing showed that a man had died there. This was the final stage of what began in the 1870s. Executions were no longer moments the nation faced together. They were events erased almost as soon as they happened. And that erasing became the system's greatest strength. As the years moved on, the lessons learned in the 1870s were copied everywhere. New prisons were designed with execution rooms built in. Witness lists stayed short. Records stayed simple. The public stayed outside. What started as a promise to reduce cruelty became a way to reduce attention. Executions did not stop arguments. They stopped conversations. Lawmakers noticed something important. When the public could not see executions, protests were smaller, debates were quieter, laws passed faster, death sentences faced less resistance. Silence made power smooth, so the state kept choosing silence. Inside prisons, staff followed routines shaped decades earlier. Guards learned not to talk. Doctors learned not to describe. Wardens learned to say as little as possible. Everyone learned the same rule. Do your job, go home, say nothing. This rule protected careers. It also protected the system. For prisoners, the fear never changed. Those on death row lived with the same question every night. Will tomorrow be the day? Without crowds or public noise, time felt endless. Days stretched, nights grew longer. Some prisoners lost track of weeks. Others counted cracks in the wall to stay sane. The silence did not calm them. It crushed them. Families suffered in a different way. They often received short notices after the fact. No warning, no chance to speak, no final goodbye. Grief arrived suddenly and without closure. For many families, the pain lasted longer because the death felt unreal. No moment to mark it, no public memory, just absence. The public, meanwhile, grew used to not knowing. Executions became statistics, numbers in reports, mentions in history books. The emotional weight faded, and with it, faded the sense that these deaths belonged to everyone. This is the lasting legacy of public prison executions. Not the rope, not the chair, not the method. The legacy is distance. Distance between the public and the punishment. Distance between the state and responsibility. Distance between death and memory. The shift that began in the 1870s did not make executions disappear. It made them easier to live with. And that may be the most dangerous change of all. Because when society stops watching, systems grow stronger without challenge. The question that started this story still has no clear answer. Is justice safer in the open or more dangerous when hidden? America chose hidden, and it has lived with that choice ever since. If you want more real stories like this, stories about prisons, power, and the moments history tried to bury, stay with the channel. These stories matter, and they only stay hidden if no one listens. The silence worked so well that people stopped noticing it. That was the moment everything changed. By the time America moved into the next decades,
the system built in the 1870s no longer felt new. Prison executions were normal. Hidden rooms, short witness lists, quiet paperwork. The public accepted it without asking how it began. That acceptance gave the state something it had never fully had before: time. Time to plan, time to repeat, time to perfect control. And once a system gets time, it grows. Prisons began to treat executions like maintenance tasks, something scheduled, something prepared for, something cleaned up afterward. Execution dates were chosen carefully, often early in the morning when towns were asleep. Guards were rotated so no one had to attend too many times in a row. Doctors learned exactly what to write and what not to write. Wardens learned to say as little as possible. Everyone learned the same rule: do your job, go home, say nothing. This rule protected careers. It also protected the system. For prisoners, the fear never changed. Those on death row lived with the same question every night: will tomorrow be the day? Without crowds or public noise, time felt endless. Days stretched, nights grew longer. Some prisoners lost track of weeks. Others counted cracks in the wall to stay sane. The silence did not calm them. It crushed them. Families suffered in a different way. They often received short notices after the fact. No warning, no chance to speak, no final goodbye. Grief arrived suddenly and without closure. For many families, the pain lasted longer because the death felt unreal. No moment to mark it, no public memory, just absence. The public, meanwhile, grew used to not knowing. Executions became statistics, numbers in reports, mentions in history books. The emotional weight faded, and with it faded the sense that these deaths belonged to everyone. This is the lasting legacy of public prison executions. Not the rope, not the chair, not the method. The legacy is distance. Distance between the public and the punishment. Distance between the state and responsibility. Distance between death and memory. The shift that began in the 1870s did not make executions disappear. It made them easier to live with. And that may be the most dangerous change of all. Because when society stops watching, systems grow stronger without challenge. The question that started this story still has no clear answer. Is justice safer in the open or more dangerous when hidden? America chose hidden, and it has lived with that choice ever since. If you want more real stories like this, stories about prisons, power, and the moments history tried to bury, stay with the channel. These stories matter, and they only stay hidden if no one listens. The silence worked so well that people stopped noticing it. That was the moment everything changed. By the time America moved into the next decades, the system built in the 1870s no longer felt new. Prison executions were normal. Hidden rooms, short witness lists, quiet paperwork. The public accepted it without asking how it began. That acceptance gave the state something it had never fully had before: time. Time to plan, time to repeat, time to perfect control. And once a system gets time, it grows. Prisons began to treat executions like maintenance tasks, something scheduled, something prepared for, something cleaned up afterward. Execution dates were chosen carefully, often early in the morning when towns were asleep. Guards were rotated so no one had to attend too many times in a row. Doctors learned exactly what to write and what not to write. Wardens learned to say as little as possible. Everyone learned the same rule:
Do your job, go home, say nothing. This rule protected careers. It also protected the system. For prisoners, the fear never changed. Those on death row lived with the same question every night: will tomorrow be the day? Without crowds or public noise, time felt endless. Days stretched, nights grew longer. Some prisoners lost track of weeks. Others counted cracks in the wall to stay sane. The silence did not calm them. It crushed them. Families suffered in a different way. They often received short notices after the fact. No warning, no chance to speak, no final goodbye. Grief arrived suddenly and without closure. For many families, the pain lasted longer because the death felt unreal. No moment to mark it, no public memory, just absence. The public, meanwhile, grew used to not knowing. Executions became statistics, numbers in reports, mentions in history books. The emotional weight faded, and with it, faded the sense that these deaths belonged to everyone. This is
the lasting legacy of public prison executions. Not the rope, not the chair, not the method. The legacy is distance. Distance between the public and the punishment. Distance between the state and responsibility. Distance between death and memory. The shift that began in the 1870s did not make executions disappear. It made them easier to live with. And that may be the most dangerous change of all. Because when society stops watching, systems grow stronger without challenge. The question that started this story still has no clear answer. Is justice safer in the open or more dangerous when hidden? America chose hidden, and it has lived with that choice ever since. If you want more real stories like this, stories about prisons, power, and the moments history tried to bury, stay with the channel. These stories matter, and they only stay hidden if no one listens. The silence worked so well that people stopped noticing it. That was the moment everything changed. By the time America moved into the next decades, the system built in the 1870s no longer felt new. Prison executions were normal. Hidden rooms, short witness lists, quiet paperwork. The public accepted it without asking how it began. That acceptance gave the state something it had never fully had before. Time. Time to plan. Time to repeat. Time to perfect control. And once a system gets time, it grows. Prisons began to treat executions like maintenance tasks. Something scheduled, something prepared for, something cleaned up afterward. Execution dates were chosen carefully, often early in the morning when towns were asleep. Guards were rotated so no one had to attend too many times in a row. Doctors learned exactly what to write and what not to write. Everything was designed to keep emotions out. But emotions never truly left. They just had nowhere to go. Some guards carried the weight home with them. They stopped talking at dinner. They avoided church. They drank more than before. Their families noticed changes they could not explain. Others shut down completely. They told themselves they were not responsible. They told themselves the law decided. They told themselves silence meant peace. But at night, many still heard the same sounds. Keys turning, doors opening, footsteps stopping. Inside death row cells, prisoners learned the signs. A change in routine, a longer visit from the chaplain, guards who suddenly spoke softly. These signs spread fear faster than words. Prisoners watched each other closely. When one man was taken away,
Others listened for sounds they hoped not to hear. And then came the worst moment, when nothing happened at all. No sound meant it was over. The public remained mostly unaware. Newspapers stopped treating executions as major events. They became small articles, often hidden deep inside the paper. No photos, no descriptions, just dates and names. This made death feel distant, like it belonged to another world. That distance affected justice in quiet ways. Jurors were more willing to sentence someone to death when they did not imagine the execution. Judges felt less pressure knowing the public would not gather. Governors signed warrants knowing few would protest. The process became smoother, and smoother systems are harder to stop. Some voices tried to break the silence. Former wardens spoke out years later. Doctors wrote letters they never sent. Ministers gave sermons that hinted at what they had seen. But without images, without crowds, without shared moments, their words faded quickly. Silence always won. The system built in the 1870s had done more than move executions indoors. It had changed how society felt about death. Death no longer demanded attention. It no longer demanded debate. It no longer demanded memory. It became administrative. And that is where danger lives. Because when something becomes routine, it's easier to expand, easier to justify, easier to defend. That is how the past reaches into the present. Every modern execution carries the shadow of the 1870s. The same quiet rooms, the same limited witnesses, the same controlled language. What began as an effort to remove cruelty ended by removing the public entirely. And once the public was gone, the system stood alone, strong, silent, unquestioned.
By now, the system no longer needed defending. It defended itself. Executions inside prisons had become so normal that many people could not imagine them any other way. Ask someone where executions happened, and they would answer without thinking. In prison, behind walls, out of sight. Few remembered that this was once a choice, and that forgetting may have been the most powerful result of all. In the years after the 1870s, records became cleaner and quieter. Execution logs listed times, names, and outcomes. They did not list fear. They did not list suffering. They did not list doubt. Those things stayed inside the people who witnessed them, and witnesses were carefully limited. This meant history itself became thin. When future generations looked back, they saw numbers, not faces, procedures, not pain. Silence shaped memory. Prisons grew larger, systems grew stronger, laws grew more complex, but the execution room stayed the same in spirit. A closed space, a small group, a final decision. The public remained distant, trusting that if something were wrong, someone would say something. But the system was designed so that saying something was hard. Speaking out meant losing a job, breaking rules, challenging authority. So most people stayed quiet. For prisoners, the silence felt endless. They lived knowing their deaths would not matter to the outside world. No crowd would gather. No story would be told in full. Their names would fade quickly. This knowledge broke some men faster than chains ever could. Others grew angry. Anger with the system, anger with the silence, anger with being erased. Occasionally, that anger escaped. Riots broke out. Guards were attacked. Cells were destroyed. Officials blamed violence on criminal minds, but they rarely looked deeper. They did not see that silence can create pressure, and pressure always seeks a release. Outside the prison, life moved on. People worked, Children went to school. Towns grew. The justice system continued quietly in the background. Executions no longer shaped public conscience. They no longer forced reflection. They no longer asked society to look at itself. They simply happened. This is how systems survive. Not by force alone, but by distance. Distance makes hard things easier to accept. Distance makes moral questions feel optional. And once a society stops asking questions, answers stop changing. The shift that began in the 1870s had done more than move executions indoors. It had taught the state how to remove the public from the hardest decisions. That lesson would be used again in other ways, in prisons, in institutions, in places where power prefers quiet. History often focuses on laws and leaders, but sometimes the most important change is emotional. The moment when people stop feeling connected. That moment happened when executions moved behind walls. And once that connection was gone, bringing it back became nearly impossible. Because silence, once accepted, feels normal. This chapter leaves us with one truth. Public prison executions did not end cruelty. They hid it. They did not end debate. They quieted it. They did not make justice cleaner. They made it distant. And distance can be more dangerous than noise. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden moments that shaped prisons, power, and punishment, stay with the channel. The silence only wins if no one listens. One mistake was all it took. It started as a whisper from inside a prison, the kind of whisper the system was built to stop. A guard spoke too freely. A clerk copied a record wrong. A detail slipped past the wall of silence. And once it slipped out, it could not be pulled back in. The execution had happened weeks earlier. Quiet, clean, official. The prison report said the sentence was carried out without issue. But the leaked detail told a different story. The man who died was not ready to die. The case came from the same era shaped by the 1870s mindset. Death behind walls, limited witnesses, no public eyes. The condemned man had maintained his innocence until the end. His lawyer had asked for more time, claiming new evidence. The request was denied. There was no crowd to pressure the governor. No journalists camped outside the prison. The execution went forward at dawn. Only later did the mistake surface. A witness had been wrong. A document had been misread. Another suspect had been ignored. By the time the truth appeared, the cell was empty. When the story reached the public, anger flared. People asked why no one had known, why no one had stopped it, why the execution moved so fast and so quietly. The answer was simple and frightening. Because that was how the system worked now. Silence made speed possible. Officials defended themselves. They said the law was followed. They said procedures were correct. They said no system is perfect. But something had changed. For the first time in years, the public felt close to an execution again. Not because they saw it, but because they realized what silence could hide. Fear returned. Not fear of crime, fear of power. Newspapers began digging into old cases. They found patterns, executions carried out quickly, appeals denied quietly, prison records that said little and revealed less. Each discovery weakened trust. People started to remember why public executions once forced caution, why officials once feared mistakes in front of crowds. Without witnesses, errors could survive. Inside prisons, staff felt the shift. Questions came from above. Investigations followed. Wardens were asked to explain details they had never expected to explain. Silence, once a shield, became a risk. Some officials blamed leaks. Others blamed reformers. Few blamed the system itself. But the damage was done. For prisoners, the story spread fast.
If the state could execute the wrong man without anyone knowing, what chance did anyone have? Hope fell, fear rose, tension grew. Prisons became more unstable, not less. The quiet system was cracking under its own weight. Lawmakers were forced to respond. Hearings were scheduled, reports were requested. Committees debated whether executions should remain hidden or become more open. Some argued for transparency. Others warned that visibility would bring chaos back. The country stood at a familiar crossroads.
Watch or turn away. The argument reached beyond executions. It touched the heart of justice itself. Should the state act where no one can see, or should society share the burden of witnessing punishment? The question echoed from the 1870s into the present, and it still had no easy answer. The silence finally broke, not with a shout, not with a riot, but with a question no one could ignore anymore. How many times had this already happened? After the exposed mistake, people began to look back. Old cases were reopened, records were reviewed, names long forgotten were read again, slowly, carefully. What they found was not one error, but a pattern. Executions that moved too fast, appeals denied without explanation, evidence dismissed because time had run out. And behind it all was the same design first built in the 1870s. Do it quietly, do it quickly, move on. Investigations revealed how deeply silence was built into the system. Prison officials were trained not to speak publicly. Doctors were instructed to keep reports short. Witnesses signed papers agreeing not to share details. Families were notified after the fact. Every step reduced noise. Every step reduced resistance. What was meant to keep order had slowly removed protection. As hearings continued, former officials finally spoke. One warden admitted he had followed orders even when he felt unsure. A doctor confessed he had signed death certificates without full certainty. A guard said he had watched a man suffer but was told to remain silent. None of them acted alone. That was the point. The system did not require cruelty from individuals. It required obedience from everyone. The public reacted with confusion and anger. Many people had trusted the system simply because they never saw it. They believed that if executions were hidden, they must be handled carefully. Now they learned the truth. Hidden does not mean careful. Hidden means unchecked. Some lawmakers pushed for reform. They called for longer appeals, independent reviews, more transparency. Some even questioned whether executions should continue at all. Others resisted. They warned that opening the process would bring back disorder, that too much visibility would weaken authority, that justice needed control, not crowds. The debate was fierce, but one thing had changed forever. The silence was no longer invisible. Inside prisons, the atmosphere shifted. Inmates sensed uncertainty. Guards sensed scrutiny. Executions slowed as reviews increased. For the first time in years, the system hesitated. That hesitation mattered. It showed that even the strongest system could pause when questioned. The lessons of the 1870s were finally being reconsidered. Back then, the public was removed from executions to reduce chaos, but no one asked what would happen decades later when distance turned into indifference. Now that cost was clear. The prison walls had kept their secret for decades. Quiet, controlled, efficient. No one questioned what happened inside. But now, the consequences of that silence were coming back to the surface. Investigations, leaks, and whistleblowers forced the system to confront what had been hidden. Papers that once collected dust in prison offices were read aloud in courts. Witnesses who had signed secrecy agreements now spoke under oath.
Families demanded answers, and the public, long removed from executions, demanded accountability. Inside the prisons, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Guards who had followed orders without question now whispered in corridors. Wardens reviewed every detail of their past actions, afraid that something would be questioned. Doctors double-checked records and certificates, fearful that errors would be exposed. Even the chaplains, once silent observers, spoke to officials about what they had seen. The quiet system was cracking. One case became a symbol of everything wrong with hidden executions. A man had been executed after a short, secret trial. Years later, new evidence suggested his innocence. Historians and lawyers revisiting the case uncovered misread testimony, ignored witnesses, and a prosecutor who rushed the trial. By the time the execution had been carried out, the error could not be undone. The public was horrified. How many others had suffered the same fate unseen? Lawmakers debated reforms fiercely. Some called for full transparency, insisting that the public had a right to witness justice being carried out. Others argued that openness would create chaos, just as it had in the days of public hangings. Newspapers wrote editorials about the moral responsibility of the state. Citizens wrote letters to governors demanding answers. The debate became a turning point for American justice. The lessons of the 1870s could no longer be ignored. Moving executions behind prison walls reduced spectacle, but it had also removed accountability. For decades, silence had protected the system. Now, that same silence was being questioned. Even prison staff felt the weight. Some admitted privately that the system, designed for efficiency, had lost its humanity. Others insisted that following procedure was enough. For the public, the shift was startling. Executions were no longer abstract. They were real. They had victims, families, and mistakes that could no longer be hidden. Awareness sparked outrage. Awareness sparked debate. And awareness sparked change. The 1870s created a system built on obedience and secrecy. But history showed that even the strongest walls could not hold the truth forever. And as scrutiny increased, one question remained. Could the system survive transparency, or would it collapse under the weight of its own silence? The next chapter explores how the legacy of public prison executions shaped the future of justice in America, and why the lessons of the past are still relevant today. The reckoning finally arrived.
By the time the 1880s approached, America could no longer ignore what the hidden executions of the 1870s had created. The silence that once protected the state now exposed its flaws. Newspapers ran detailed accounts of past mistakes. Families of the executed demanded investigations. Lawyers filed appeals that had long been denied. The system was being forced into the light. Inside prisons, tension was palpable. Guards who had once followed orders without question now watched their steps carefully. Wardens re-examined protocols. Doctors reviewed every record, every signature, knowing that errors could no longer be hidden behind walls. Chaplains spoke freely for the first time about what they had witnessed, their words carrying the weight of decades of quiet horror. The lessons of public prison executions were undeniable. Moving death behind walls had reduced spectacle, but it had also removed accountability. People realized that secrecy had made errors easier, suffering longer, and injustice invisible. One botched execution could now be traced, examined, and debated, but countless others from decades past remained lost to history. Reforms began to take shape. States reconsidered procedures. Witnesses were expanded. Some argued for partial transparency in executions, while others pushed for more humane methods and longer appeals. The conversation that began in whispers now roared through courts, newspapers, and public debates. The very system built to hide death
was learning that silence could no longer protect it. And yet, the legacy remained. Executions behind walls continued, but with awareness, oversight, and caution. The fear, suffering, and human cost could never be fully erased. The shift that began in the 1870s had permanently changed the relationship between the public, the state, and justice itself. The past showed a clear truth. When death is hidden, power grows unchecked. When justice happens in silence, mistakes can multiply. And when society turns away, it risks forgetting that every execution is not just a sentence, it is a life. Public prison executions ended as a norm, but their lessons live on. They remind us that accountability cannot be silenced, and that justice, no matter how controlled, must always be witnessed, questioned, and remembered. The story ends here, but its echoes remain, shaping prisons, laws, and society even today. If you followed this journey, remember, history hides in quiet places, but truth always finds a way to speak. The truth doesn't stay hidden forever, and neither should you miss it. If this story shocked you, there's so much more waiting behind the walls. Subscribe now and join us as we reveal history's darkest secrets. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that changes everything.